With the incoming American administration proposing to increase tariffs, and particularly on Chinese goods, how will Nintendo adapt? What will be the impact on their American sales, their pricing, their Switch successor console, and for their overall plans? We will see what Satoru Iwata had to say about tariffs previously, what representations to the American government Nintendo made on tariffs when video game tariffs were mooted in 2019, and why these changes might have an impact beyond the USA. Settle in for a Nintendo Forecast deep dive on Nintendo and tariffs. So a tariff is simply a tax placed on goods as they enter or leave the country. The idea being that if you want to go outside a country to purchase items, you should pay more for it. The merits and demerits of tariffs have been adjudicated for centuries. A huge swathe of 19th century British politics was absolutely dominated by the tariff regime called the Corn Laws. But while I will sketch out different perspectives, as with any politics-adjacent issue on this channel, I am far more interested in shedding light than generating heat, which is one of the reasons I opted not to cover this topic prior to the American election, and it's why, although I will explore different scenarios and perspectives, I don't feel it's the role of this channel to proselytize for any particular economic position for any specific country. The fact is that irrespective of people's personal views, this issue is something Nintendo may find they need to address in the immediate future, and so this video is about considering what that might look like. And one helpful report released in October 2024 is from the Consumer Technology Association, a trade association representing the US consumer technology industry. Clearly a sector which relies hugely on Chinese labour and Chinese-made resources is not going to be impartial in these matters, and as they note in their foreword, they have expressed concern since the original tariff regime on Chinese imports was imposed, tariff which has remained in place for 6 years. Still, they do an effective job of outlining the goals of tariff proponents: to move manufacturing back to the USA, to protect US communities and workers from foreign competition, to collect greater tariff revenue to replace the US income tax, to respond in kind to other countries who maintain higher tariff rates than in the US, to retaliate against countries who restrict US exports and investment, and to punish countries who move away from the US dollar as the asset of denomination for international transactions. The counter-argument is that this barriers higher costs for business, less efficient business practices as they do not have to manage foreign competition to the same degree, and ultimately less innovation in the marketplace. Analysis from the Tax Foundation has shown that previous tariffs have been passed almost entirely to the consumer, so they would be expected to increase the costs for consumers and potentially to spark inflation. Specifically with respect to video game consoles, Nintendo themselves co-authored a letter with Microsoft and Sony to make representations to the American government in 2019 to insulate the video game industry from the effect of tariff barriers. I quote their letter. In particular, tariffs on video game consoles would injure consumers, video game developers, retailers, and console manufacturers, put thousands of high-value, rewarding US jobs at risk, and stifle innovation in our industry and beyond. Now, politicians, it is said, campaign in poetry but govern in prose, and initial tariff proposals will doubtless be subject to ongoing negotiations and discussions of this kind. In August 2019, perhaps in response to the representations made by Nintendo and others, video game imports were specifically excluded from the tariff regime imposed by the then administration, and it's quite possible similar representations may be made this time to ensure that video game consoles do not rocket in price, and the specifics of the proposals still need to be hammered out. Proposals have included a 10% to 20% tariff on all imports and a higher, perhaps 60% levy on goods from China. On the Consumer Technology Association figures, tariffs on video games could rise from 0% to 61%. The CTA's estimate is that the increase in consumer prices for video game consoles would be just shy of 40%. The Switch OLED would become $490, Tears of the Kingdom would be $98, and most Switch releases $84. It's not necessarily the case that prices would be in this scale, but before we look into this any deeper, let's just take a bit of historical context into account. Now, these prices are a drastic increase compared to recent years, but historically, these kinds of prices for video game consoles and games are far from unprecedented. The effect of inflation means that a dollar in 1996 would be worth $2 today, and this rule of thumb allows us to see that these prices, while likely to be shocking to consumers and impactful for the industry, particularly in the short term, actually wouldn't be a historic high. Many N64 games retail for $70, which would be $140 in today's terms, while many titles were $40 or $50 back then, which would be in the $80 to $100 range today. The video game market is very different today and much larger than it was in the past, but clearly a mass of consumers were willing to pay these kinds of prices in times gone by. Of course, it's not just about one individual price, but the balance of prices in the marketplace, including housing, food, and other costs that people face, as well as the underlying rate of inflation that will affect people's purchasing decisions. In an optimistic scenario for tariff imposers, it would reshape the market so that domestic customers are wealthier and can spend on luxury imported items if they choose to do so. In a pessimistic scenario, the barriers to business ratchet ever upwards in a return to the tariff battles of the 1920s. There are specific risks for the video game industry which were enumerated in the Microsoft, Nintendo, Sony joint letter of 2019, which stated, each video game console comprises dozens of complex components sourced from multiple countries. A change in even a single supplier must be vetted carefully to mitigate risks of production quality, unreliability, and consumer safety issues. Tariffs would significantly disrupt our company's business and add significant costs that would depress sales of video game consoles and the games and services that drive the profitability of this market segment. They also note, the ripple effect of harm could be dramatic. Our consoles have generated a vast ecosystem of small and medium-sized game developers. A significant number of the games played on Microsoft, Nintendo, and Sony Interactive Entertainment video game consoles are not developed by our companies in-house. Now, Nintendo perhaps have less of an American presence than others, but nevertheless they have Nintendo Software Technology in Redmond, Retro Studios in Austin, and a number of American firms such as the Californian-based WayForward, Metroid Prime Remastered co-developers Iron Galaxy, and others who have collaborated with them in recent years. Another issue is the consequence to retailers. This is what Nintendo said in 2019. Retailers that distribute our video game consoles would also feel the effects of this significant tariff. Video game consoles are primarily sold at brick-and-mortar retailers such as GameStop, Best Buy, and Walmart. Given that retail margins on video game consoles are generally very tight, we see no possible reasonable scenario for retailers other than passing tariff costs down to consumers. Any imposition of tariffs leading into the winter holidays, the strongest sales season for consoles, would have a significant negative effect on US-based retailers and their employees, in particular because promotional offers on consoles are important to driving sales volume. Tariffs would make it especially difficult for both console makers and retailers to support the types of promotional offers typical of the holiday season. Nevertheless, things have moved on considerably, with new digital-only consoles already starting to freeze out retailers from the game sales market. While this leads to better margins for gaming giants, it also means the market impact of tariffs would be somewhat lessened for big retailers. Yes, they take a loss, but they've already taken some of that loss anyway. I do think this would have a bigger proportionate impact on Nintendo compared to other companies, as Nintendo has always conducted a larger proportion of its business with physical merchandise. Partly that's because they have a stronger base in Japan, and Japan has been later to adopt digital technologies. Partly it's because they are in spirit, to a large degree, a toy company, and they rely on the tactile nature of their products for part of their charm. And partly it's because they appeal to families and children, and so a large number of items are gifted, and it's hard to get that warm, unwrapping feeling on Christmas morning when there's nothing to physically unwrap. But all this was 5 years ago, and a lot has changed since. Indeed, in the past, Nintendo has managed to be quite fleet of foot with regard to its dealings. In 2019, and likely in partial response to the tariff threat, Nintendo moved a good deal of its manufacturing to Vietnam, thereby sidestepping some of these issues. It also has manufacturing bases in Malaysia, and of course its suppliers are also moving out of China. Minabe Mitsumi, a supplier to Nintendo, started transitioning to Cambodia in 2019, while other countries have been identified as potential alternatives to China. India also has a good deal of expertise, although the country generally focuses on domestic consumption rather than on exports. But this strategy is widely pursued in the tech industry and is called the China Plus One, or in the case of Nintendo, China Plus Two and 4 more. The idea is that leaving China completely for technology manufacturing is risky. China has a huge manufacturing skills base, well-embedded supply chains for metals and plastics, and while labour costs are increasing, their efficiency is prodigious to balance it out. Moreover, the company's overheads are still going to be much larger in many countries outside of China. We're talking administrative costs, regulation, insurance, maintenance costs, and so on, which are likely to cost that much more, as well as simply the cost of raw materials. Exiting China contains its own costs, but a China Plus One, or Plus Two, or Plus Three, or even Plus Four strategy has benefits in terms of global diversification of skills, insulating themselves against the political risk and indeed geographic risk, as we saw with the huge impact of Typhoon Yagi on the Vietnamese manufacturing sector in recent months. It's no bad thing to have multiple manufacturing bases across the world. There are other significant costs to leaving China completely, though. In China, if a factory closes early, the expectation would be that employees are paid until the end of their contracts, and most contracts are on a 1 to 2 year basis, and perhaps even longer in highly competitive sectors which need specific expertise. That is a huge upfront cost to wear for the unprepared. There have also been instances where tools and moulds sent to China for use in their manufacturing process are not returned when companies move out of China because the Chinese believe that ownership lies with them, and even if you have strict ownership agreements, these need to be adjudicated by a Chinese court, who might not be that sympathetic to foreign exporters who are leaving their country. Plus, Chinese factories have a large amount of knowledge about the production of goods and a cavalier approach to copyright law, which means that they could be in a position to make their own products indefinitely, undercutting the official products. This isn't necessarily such a risk for video game manufacture. Nintendo's joint letter explained, Chinese-developed and branded video game consoles are virtually non-existent. One video game console that launched in 2016 has not been well received by the market. Moreover, because margins are tight due to the nature of our business model, incentives to steal IP to make counterfeit consoles are exceptionally weak. Video game consoles are also relatively complex types of equipment, so the amount of effort and cost required to manufacture infringing or illegitimate products would not be justified by potential returns. But of course, Nintendo's more modular consoles, like the Switch, contain multiple parts. We're not just talking about the core machine, but the Joy-Cons, the docks, Pro Controllers, steering wheels, and so on, which could all be more readily pirated. Basically, China has no interest in making it comfortable or easy for major international firms to exit manufacturing agreements with them. Having said that, once a critical mass of manufacturers exit a country, some of these innate benefits are likely to alter. When you have a mass-scale manufacturing, you benefit from the so-called economies of scale, savings from doing things en masse as opposed to in a smaller quantity. Therefore, even if Nintendo stuck with China for most of its manufacturing needs, and remember Alamo is still being manufactured in China, it would still likely face a long-term escalation in costs if the rest of the industry decided to move away. There is also a continual worry about political instability with the new, though possibly not for very long in the job, Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba hawkish about defence as a self-identified military otaku, which might make relationships with China all the bumpier. Now, there are other options being mooted for the long term. Japan has tried to bring some elements of highly skilled chip production back to Japan, while Nintendo's chip partners Nvidia especially are touting their ability to build AI factories which could save costs massively in the long term. The imposition of tariffs creates huge financial incentives to try to find equivalent savings elsewhere through different means. Nevertheless, manufacturing costs will doubtless rise. Nintendo may feel that they could absorb some of the transitional costs of changing manufacturers without passing them on to the consumer, as these are fixed upfront costs rather than necessarily ongoing costs, although of course some of the regulatory changes would mean that there would be increased ongoing costs as well. And it also means that their massive amount of cash on hand would come into play, allowing Nintendo to be a lot more nimble in the marketplace compared to less well-prepared competitors. For US consumers, though, even if Nintendo managed to dodge a mooted 60% tariff on Chinese imported goods and managed to absorb transitional costs, tariffs in the 10 to 20% region would still have a fairly big impact on American consumers. Satoru Iwata commented on tariffs once in the context of how to deal with entering new markets where tariffs were being imposed. He stated, "The price issue is not only a question of how much is reasonable in an emerging country. For example, in some countries which adopt protectionist stances, the high tariffs could make video game systems several times more expensive, so we need to see if we can find an appropriate way to avoid such a thing from happening. Considering such situations, it would be difficult to do the same business in all emerging countries. Basically, if it's too pricey, it's not worth entering the market. But there's no way that Nintendo will exit the American market, which is absolutely huge for them. So they need to find a way to make a pitch that is, in their words, reasonable. In many ways, though, Nintendo is well positioned on this. They already have a console on the cheaper end, and so a proportionate increase across the entire line of video game consoles would have a smaller market impact on them compared to the competition. They also have the benefit of time, at least some time. Yes, I'm talking about waiting for the Switch successor console, but to be clear, I'm not saying that they will delay indefinitely. But even if they announce the console in late January, as I think is currently the most likely, they don't need to confirm pricing at this point. The Switch had its price reveal just 7 weeks before launch, and while I think Nintendo will want a short reveal-to-release window, I doubt they can get it that long. If they reveal in January, we could be looking at a release post-Golden Week, late May to early July, or perhaps in September. That means the earliest they would need to communicate pricing would be the end of February, and possibly not even until July. Of course, they will need to brief retailers and give them a landing zone for price, but it's likely that the very early sales of the system will be extremely price inelastic. That is to say, that demand from early adopters is likely to be so high off the back of the original Switch's success that almost irrespective of the high price point, people will purchase, and so the risk for retailers of ordering large amounts of a product with an uncertain price is mitigated by the fact that it is so in demand. Plus, Nintendo has had a good track record with retailers before and has been ruthless about maintaining the prices of their games, which helps retailers make decent margins as well. I think it's probably unlikely that video games will escalate in cost 60%, and I think these potential costs would 90% likely be brought down considerably through negotiations or mitigation strategies. Still, a 10 to 20% tariff could see more subtle but still significant price rises for games and consoles in the USA, not to anywhere near the heights of the 1990s, but still to a relatively expensive price point, perhaps $80 being the standard for a AAA game. And the cost and uncertainty around manufacture mean that, as I've speculated before, the console prices are not likely to be any lower. I tend to give the Switch successor forecast prices in US dollars as opposed to yen, as these are more broadly comprehended, although obviously an increase in the dollar amount under a tariff regime might not have quite the same impact abroad. That said, I think a $400 price tag remains the absolute bare minimum we could expect, and realistically, I would say 70% likely the next console price tag will have a 4 at the front in terms of its American dollars figure. So $449 or $499 being the most obvious candidates, and I would say $499 is actually fairly likely. It keeps it just under the psychological barrier of $500, and with Sony and Microsoft potentially having to adjust the prices of even their lower cost models to account for tariffs themselves, or to quickly replace them with models with more favourable margins, the new Nintendo system could still be competitive with the lower powered versions of PlayStation and Xbox. However, it also absorbs tariff costs to some degree and insulates Nintendo to a slight degree against the inflationary effect of tariffs in a marketplace. It's far easier to price high out of the gate when enthusiasm for the console is at fever pitch and then stick to that price for longer than to ramp up prices in the middle of your console lifecycle. Given the uncertainty, I also think there's only a 10% chance that we will see a price announcement from Nintendo this year, and probably only a 10% chance we will see an announcement between New Year and the American Inauguration Day on the 20th of January 2025. To be clear, we could see a console announcement just without the price in this period, although at this point I feel the most likely dates for your calendar are 28th, 29th, 30th January 2025, the week before the next investors briefing and the week after the American media cycle around the new president has dissipated. It's not that the tariff situation will necessarily be hugely more clear at that point. I'm no expert on the American legal system, but my understanding is that tariffs would need to be legislated for in the American Congress, which would take a lot more time than a simple executive order from the president. But in a fast-changing environment, it is in Nintendo's interests to wait until the latest possible point before committing to a particular strategy. And so I think it will be many months before we have a full confirmation of the next console's price. Continuing on the same topic, I did a deeper dive into price quite recently, and I recommend revisiting it now as it goes through the logistics that Nintendo might face, tariffs aside, of pricing their next console. That video is on screen right now. Thanks as ever for watching, and I'll see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.